Welcome to another edition of HorseCenter, everyone. I am Brian Zipsy, and as always, I have the excellent pleasure of being joined by my co-host to the East Coast. That's Matt Schiffman. How are you today, Matt?
I am good, Brian. I am enjoying this week. We're getting a little bit of a breather in the Triple Crown after the Preakness, with still more than 2 weeks until the Belmont.
Yeah, that's true, Matt, although we're not taking a full breather from the Triple Crown because we have a special show. Folks, if you are new to us, every once in a while, Matt and I like to go back in time, do a little flashback show, and I think we put together a good one here for you. We're talking about the very best of the Belmont Stakes. Hey, it's a quiet weekend of racing. We figured this is the perfect time to talk about the wonderful history of the Belmont Stakes. Matt and I are only going to go back about 50 years because that's as far as we can remember, Matt. But of course, within that 50-year period, we're going to start with 1973, the incomparable performance by the great Secretariat.
Yes, Brian, when you say the Belmont Stakes, I think everybody has to respond and think about the great Secretariat, the 1973 Triple Crown, which came after a big break from Triple Crown winners, and his just, unbelievable performance in all three jewels. He captured the attention of the general public in our country, probably more than any other racehorse ever did.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that, Matt, at least in our lifetimes. 1973, we were ripe and ready for a new Triple Crown winner. It had been 25 years since Citation ran away with the Triple Crown back in 1948. Secretariat had a tough rival, though, Matt, in Sham. Sham, coming from California via New York, he gave Secretariat a decent race in both the Kentucky Derby and the Preakness. So in the Belmont, something crazy happened, Matt. These two went out fast. They went head-to-head, ding-donging it on the lead, Matt. I had to remind myself of this fact. The fractions of this Belmont, half mile, 3/4 of a mile, a mile and a quarter, and of course the final time, a mile and a half, were the fastest Belmont Stakes ever. So not only did Secretariat run super fast final time, he ran super fast the whole way. Sham was with him for about half the race. Sham came back with a little injury after the race, but Secretariat just kept on going, Matt.
Yeah, he sure did, and nobody was going to keep up with Secretariat on that day. The fractions, the steady, fast fractions, every single quarter mile, and regardless of the fact that it was a small field, it was maybe the greatest performance in the history of racing, my favorite horse in the history of racing, as he was for so many of our generation.
Absolutely. I was in the stands. I was a young boy in the stands, and I remember how the upper grandstand that we were sitting in was just shaking, and people were going absolutely bonkers, Matt. 31 lengths. He was moving like a tremendous machine. 2:24 final time. That will never be touched. It was the greatest performance, certainly, of modern racing, and I don't think we'll ever see a performance as good as Secretariat in the 73 Belmont. The best Belmont ever, performance in the Belmont ever, probably the most memorable. And Matt, speaking of most memorable Belmont Stakes, we only have to flash forward about 5 years to the 1978 Belmont. Affirmed and Alydar, of course, is the one I'm speaking of. Secretariat was the greatest performance in the Belmont Stakes ever. This was the greatest Belmont Stakes ever. Affirmed and Alydar going at it, a rivalry in the 1978 Belmont Stakes.
Yes, Brian, and right. And you mentioned the rivalry between Secretariat and Sham. It was nothing compared to the rivalry between Affirmed and Alydar, which did not just happen in all three of the Triple Crown races, but went back to their 2-year-old campaigns when they traded victories also. But there was nothing quite like the stretch battle in the Triple Crown finale in the Belmont Stakes, when Affirmed was able to win a narrow victory. I was a big Affirmed fan. And I was also a big Steve Cawthon fan. So not only was that rivalry of Affirmed and Alydar going on, but the whole sensation about the 18-year-old Steve Cawthon was also part of what was happening in that particular Belmont.
Yeah, this Belmont Stakes had it all, Matt. Affirmed and Alydar, as you said, a great rivalry. Started at two. I actually saw Alydar run right by Affirmed in the Champagne Stakes as 2-year-olds. They went back and forth, like you said, at two. Alydar was actually the favorite for the Kentucky Derby that year. Over 40 years later, I still find it hard to believe that Affirmed actually beat Alydar in all 3 legs. While Sham was a really nice horse and a good rival for Secretariat, Alydar, folks, was an amazing horse and one of the best horses I've ever seen. So for Affirmed to beat him in all 3 legs, they got closer each time. Alydar rallied at him in the Derby, got a little closer in the Preakness. And then in the Belmont, of course, John Veach's trainer said, let's go after him early. And they did. They hooked up on the backstretch, early on the backstretch, Matt. And it was about a mile of head-to-head battle between 2 great racehorses. You had the kid up on Affirmed, and Affirmed deserved all the accolades he gets. He won 22 of 29 lifetime, but none was better, none was bigger than when he held off and he kind of surged at the end to beat his great rival, Alydar, in that 1978 Belmont Stakes. Matt, let's stick with the theme of Triple Crown winners, because I think another special Triple Crown came in 2015, much more recently, when we saw American Pharoah do something that no horse had done since Affirmed. 37 years, Matt, since we saw a Triple Crown winner. We were there together to watch American Pharoah break the streak in the Belmont Stakes.
Yeah, we were there together, Brian. And I know out of these Belmont Stakes that we're going to talk about, you went to most of these races. For me, I didn't go to quite as many. And for me, American Pharoah would turn out to be the first Triple Crown winner that I got to see. And American Pharoah, captured the attention of the American general public a good bit also. Maybe not to the extent that Secretariat did, but American Pharoah, it was quite a crowd that day and quite an exciting finish when American Pharoah became the first Triple Crown winner in, you said, 37 years.
Yeah, American Pharoah also was a horse, a beloved horse. I mean, he was a sweet horse to be around. He had been the 2-year-old champion, which is very rare in modern racing to have a horse who's 2-year-old champion, 3-year-old champion. Later that year, he won the Breeders' Cup Classic, becoming the first horse to ever win the Triple Crown in the Breeders' Cup Classic. Only 9 of 11 lifetime. He only ran 11 times, but I think he had some competition in there, Frosted and a few others. And American Pharoah got the job done. He did it easily in that Belmont Stakes as he wired the race, Matt. Coming down the stretch, the whole crowd was going crazy to see American Pharoah become the first Triple Crown winner in a long, long time. And surprisingly, Matt, on these lists of the best of the Belmont Stakes, we're not going to have the other 2 Triple Crown winners of the modern era. Seattle Slew, I think, was one of the greatest horses of this era. But, his Belmont was, pretty routine. It wasn't a good field he was beating, and he went to the lead and did it there. Justified, much the same. I don't think he beat a great group in the most recent Triple Crown winner, but certainly 2 we should mention. Let's start to talk about horses that didn't win the Triple Crown, Matt, but they came really close. Let's start in first with 1979. I think people forget how good a horse Coastal was, Matt, the horse that beat Spectacular Bid in the 1979 Belmont Stakes.
And man, and you also said, forget how good a horse Coastal was. I think people forget how great a horse Spectacular Bid was at that time, and of course would become as his career moved on, as at 3 and then at 4 years old. Also, Spectacular Bid, ran into the fact that he was a great horse, but he was on the heels of a series of fantastic Triple Crown winners in Secretariat, Seattle Slew, and Affirmed. And here comes along spectacular bid for the trainer Buddy Delp, the brash Buddy Delp. Another year, and in the Belmont Stakes, it sure looked like he was going to become another Triple Crown winner.
Oh, this was absolutely shocking, man. Spectacular Bid could not have been a bigger favorite in this Belmont Stakes. He came to that Belmont off of 12 straight stakes wins. He had track records. He overcame things like in the Florida Derby. He was just a monster. He won the Derby and the Preakness easily. 2-year-old champion for sure, a 3-year-old champion for sure, and of course at 4 he was an undefeated champion. For my money, he's the best horse that raced in America since Secretariat. That's how good I thought Spectacular Bid went. But there was a lot of controversy in this race. Inexperienced Ronnie Franklin, who really never did anything in his career much other than riding Spectacular Bid, gave him a pretty bad ride. He had the safety pin. Excuse or not, he got really sick from an infection from that safety pin after the Belmont. So there was a lot going on in that Belmont. Coastal was a up-and-comer, well-bred horse who had just won the Peter Pan by something like 14 lengths, loved Belmont Park, ran a big Belmont, and he upset the bid in I think, the biggest upset of all the Belmont Stakes that we've seen, Matt. 1998 had a different feel because I don't think people thought that Real Quiet was head and shoulders above Victory Gallop, but we really thought that Real Quiet was about to be a Belmont winner, especially when he opened up at the head of the stretch in the 1998 Belmont Stakes.
Sure did, and this was a young Bob Baffert just at the beginnings of his domination in the Triple Crown series, going for a Triple Crown with Real Quiet coming in from the West. And just as a sidelight, I think it's really interesting, folks, as we watch some of the replays of these great races, and you look at some of the differences between racing then and now, and you look at some of the early pace setters in these races and how hard horses got sent out on the lead to set big paces in races, things that just don't happen nowadays. But anyway, back to Victory Gallop, who was ridden by Gary Stevens in this race, rallying from second to last, trained by Elliott Walden, who retired from training not too long after that, and we know him now as the racing director at Windstar Farm, where he's had a lot of success.
Between horses, and Real Quiet is gaining ground on the outside. He's 3 off the rail. He's 3rd now and going up as they go to the far turn. It's Cholito in front, Grand Slam 2nd, and Real Quiet trying for the Triple Crown on the outside 3rd. Yarrow Bray is 4th at this point. Limit Out is dropping back. Around the turn, Cholito still has the lead. Now here comes Grand Slam to challenge, and Real Quiet on the outside, 3 of them across the track. Coming to the top of the stretch. On the inside, Cholito trying to hang on. Real Quiet with a burst of speed takes the lead by a head. Grand Slam is right there between horses. Thomas Joe is flying from the back of the pack. He's 4th now with McCarran as they straighten away in the lane of the Belmont. Real Quiet takes command. A roar from the crowd as he bounces away by 3.5 lengths. Thomas Joe is closing. Victory Gallop is now 2nd. Down the stretch they come. Real Quiet in front. Here comes Victory Gallop with Gary Stevens. It's Real Quiet to Sorbo, but on the outside, Victory Gallop too tight to call. On the inside, was it Real Quiet? Did he win the Triple Crown? On the outside, Victory Gallop. Neither jockey indicating that they think they won it. That's a photo finish.
Yeah, Victory Gallop was a really nice horse, a really consistent horse. He actually went on to become a champion as a 4-year-old. Victory Gallop was no big upset here in the Belmont Stakes, but Real Quiet. Hey, I was at Santa Anita and I saw Indian Charlie bop Real Quiet in the nose. He was not the preferred Baffert coming to that Kentucky Derby, but Real Quiet pretty easily held off the rally by Victory Gallop in that Kentucky Derby. He beat him easier in the Preakness. Victory Gallop was 2nd in both of them in the Belmont. What a stretch run, because Kentis almost sent Real Quiet. He opened up about 5 lengths but Victory Gallop just kept coming. He might have gotten a little bit easier victory than the very, very narrow margin at the wire. But of course, Real Quiet was bearing out. Question was whether he would have been DQ'd had he held on, because he just barely held on. But Victory Gallop denied a Triple Crown win on the shadow of the wire in 1998. Another big upset, Matt, and this one may have been the most upsetting to the general public, was 2004, Birdstone. Birdstone was not a bad horse, but he had not done much yet as a 3-year-old. He was the Champagne winner at Belmont Park as a 2-year-old for owner Mary Lou Whitney and trainer Nick Zito, but it was all Smarty Jones as he won the Derby. He was still unbeaten when he romped in the Preakness, Matt, and everybody was kind of hoping that the little horse from Philadelphia, Smarty Jones, was going to win that Belmont.
Yeah, and this was another example of a horse that captured the imaginations of the American public as he kept on winning and winning and winning and winning, with connections from Pennsylvania. He being a Pennsylvania bred, it was a whole different thing in there, and it looked like Smarty Jones was going to win it. He had he had pace pressure to contend with early on. He handled that. I mean, there were good horses in the field. Rock Hard 10 in that race got the lead, turning for home, and it looked like we were going to have a Triple Crown winner after all the years had begun to build up since Affirmed had won the Triple Crown back in '78. But it was Birdstone coming down the stretch. And let me tell you, I thought the race call of Tom Durkin in this race was one. Tom Durkin had many race calls that I think are one of the greatest race calls ever in horse racing. But this was one of them, capturing the drama of the stretch drive, and then capturing the drama of the result with the air going out of the crowd when Smarty Jones got past.
Smarty Jones is a 4-length lead. Birdstone is moving to be second on the outside. Rock Hard 10 is back to third, and Smarty Jones enters the stretch to the roar of 120,000. But Birdstone is going to make him earn it today. The whip is out on Smarty Jones. It's been 26 years. It's just one furlong away. Birdstone is an outside front. They're coming down to the finish. Can Smarty Jones hold on? Here comes Birdstone. Birdstone surges past. Birdstone wins the Belmont Stakes. Smarty Jones was valiant but vanquished, finishing second. Royal Assault came on to be third. And so this Triple Crown remains vacated for 26 long years. And this magical Triple Crown trail of Smarty Jones comes to a disheartening end in the final strides of the Belmont Stakes.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons why this Belmont Stakes is so memorable. It was just because so many people were rooting for Smarty Jones. Mary Lou Whitney actually felt bad after the race that her horse had won the Belmont, because Smarty Jones was so popular, and yeah, he had to work pretty hard during the early stages of the race, and you could just see Birdstone really starting to pick up horses on the turn there, Matt. But you still thought Smarty Jones was going to do it, and even halfway down the stretch, you thought he might hold him off. He had won every race before, but Birdstone had that momentum, reeled him in, and kind of, as you said, took the air out of everything, and Durkin captured that beautifully. Birdstone was not a one-hit wonder. I said he won the Champagne at 2. He came back to win the Travers later that summer. He didn't race that much, unfortunately, due to injury. He was 5 of 9, and of course, Smarty Jones never ran again. But one of the most memorable Belmont Stakes editions was 2004. A few years later, Matt, when we talked about the Belmont Stakes show, our favorites, one of our favorites was both of us said 2007 has to be on the list, and that's Rags to Riches, the filly. A filly hadn't won the Belmont Stakes in 102 years, Matt. I think you remember when Tanya won it back in 1905. I don't remember, of course. I'm not old enough to remember that as with you, Matt. But 102 years, Rags to Riches, and she did it in certainly not the easiest way.
Yeah, Brian, and it's worth noting too that Rags to Riches would become only the third filly to win the Belmont Stakes, but is the only filly to do it at the 1.5-mile distance. And it was a heck of a field. There were terrific horses in the race. Curlin was in the race. Hard Spun was in the race, but Rags to Riches, in what turned out to be a race that had pretty slow early fractions, was able to get the victory. The filly for Todd Pletcher, his first Belmont Stakes victory.
And the leader is CP West. Nothing left for Slow's Tizzy. Here comes Hardspun, and Curlin is coming on, throwing between horses, and Rags to Riches is coming with a 4-wide sweep, and Tiago is in behind them, and at the top of the stretch, a filly is in front of the Belmont, but Curlin is right there with her. These two in a battle of the sexes in the Belmont Stakes. It is Curlin on the inside, Rags to Riches on the outside. A desperate finish. Rags to Riches and Krone. They're coming down to the wire. It's going to be very close, and it's going to be a filly in the Belmont. Rags to Riches has beaten Krone in 100 years of Belmont history. The first filly to win it in over a century.
Absolutely. Rags to Riches was kind of a monster out in California. She came to Kentucky. She won the Kentucky Oaks very nicely. And then she faced Curlin. And this race was all about Rags to Riches and Curlin for me. Street Sense didn't make the Belmont after trading places with Curlin in the Derby and the Preakness. So it was Curlin who was the heavy favorite. Curlin, of course, who went on to become one of the greatest horses of this century. And Rags to Riches stumbled at the start, and Rags to Riches hooked up with Curlin. And much like Swiss Skydiver did in the Preakness last year with Authentic, it was the filly that was just a little bit better than the colt in the late stages. Unfortunately, Rags to Riches didn't race much, only one more start, where she was injured in the Gazelle after the Belmont. But she'll always be remembered for that special win in the 2007 Belmont Stakes, Matt. Let's talk about some other huge performances in the Belmont, and one that you had on your list, Matt, which made a lot of sense to me, was 1987. This was a horse that I saw run early on his 2-year-old career at Monmouth Park. He did it with a late run. He was a New Jersey horse through and through. And Bet Twice got his revenge on Alysheba in that 87 Belmont in a big way.
Yeah, and it was an amazing performance, and I think special to us because we were both living in New Jersey. We went to Monmouth Park a great deal, and Bet Twice, of course, was stabled at Monmouth Park and trained by the great Jimmy Kroll at the New Jersey Shore racetrack. And talking about rivalries that we mentioned, there was a heck of a rivalry between Bet Twice and Alysheba. They met 9 times in their career, Brian, with Bet Twice winning 3 of them and Alysheba winning 4 of them. I mentioned stuff earlier on that was different about racing then to now. Well, that's one of the things that's different for sure. 2 great horses facing off against each other 9 times. That just doesn't happen nowadays.
Right, and that rivalry started when they were 2, and it went well into their 4-year-old seasons. Bet Twice probably wasn't as good at 4 as he was earlier in his career. And of course, we all know what Alysheba went on to become the all-time money winner at the time. But Alysheba ran a memorable Kentucky Derby to beat Bet Twice, who was right there in the stretch after Alysheba stumbled and almost went down. In the Preakness, Alysheba beat him again. But in the Belmont, and I should mention that Alysheba was without Lasix in the Belmont. It was outlawed in Belmont back then, in New York back then. So he had run on Lasix. He didn't get it in the Belmont. Bet Twice had no trouble without Lasix. Rolled by, what was it, not 14 lengths in that Belmont. Alysheba was in the photo for second, but great performance by Bet Twice. But for my money, the next year might have been the biggest Belmont performance outside of Secretariat that I ever saw, Matt. 1988 was a horse I really got on early in his 3-year-old year. His name was Risen Star. You know who his sire was, Matt.
Risen Star was sired by, as we started off this whole show, by the great Secretariat. And as you mentioned, even more of a victory. I think the official call was 14 3/4 lengths in there. And of course, this turned out to be the final start of his career.
Yeah, Risen Star kind of came from nowhere, trained by Louis Roussel, owned by Ronnie Lamarck. He was a New Orleans horse who was kind of quietly on the Kentucky Derby trail early on. He got a win in the Louisiana Derby, and he got a win over 49er earlier in Keeneland as well. But he was late, he was wide, and he couldn't get up in that Kentucky Derby. He finished third to Winning Colors, the filly, winning the Kentucky Derby that year. But in the Preakness, he did it. And then in the Belmont, he showed that he was the closest thing to Secretariat in a while, at least at a mile and a half of Belmont, because that 14 3/4 length victory was just awesome. Of all the horses that got retired after the Triple Crown, maybe Risen Star is the one I regret the most, not seeing what he would go on to do after that awesome, awesome Belmont Stakes display. Another awesome Belmont Stakes display was New York's Easy Goer, Matt. What a horse Easy Goer was. What a rivalry with Sunday Silence. Easy Goer got his revenge, much like Bet Twice when they got to Belmont Park.
Yeah, a lot of the themes that we've been talking about, Brian, in that makes the Belmont Stakes such a special race, rivalry between horses. It was true with Easy Goer and Sunday Silence, Triple Crown on the line, and so many of the things that we talked about. This was another one of those finishes that turned out to be not very close, as Easy Goer turned the tables and drew off to win by 8 lengths.
Yeah, and in the rivalry, Matt, Sunday Silence actually won 3 out of 4. Yeah. Very, very different racehorses. Sunday Silence was a narrow, sleek, black, almost black colt by Halo, who could kind of quickly accelerate, while Easy Goer was that big chestnut with that giant chest out of Alydar, who just gobbled up ground with every stride. And Belmont Park was his favorite track, and he showed it in this Belmont Stakes. Sunday Silence was never going to beat Easy Goer at Belmont at probably a lesser distance, but certainly not at a mile and a half. Awesome performance by Easy Goer, who was a truly great horse. He won 14 20 lifetime, Matt, and he got his revenge on Sunday Silence at least that one time in this 1989 Belmont Stakes. All right, Matt, we're flying through. We only got a few more. The next couple we're going to show come in quagmires, sloppy racetracks, but there's a reason we're showing them. 1982, you mentioned as one of the best performances ever that you saw in the Belmont Stakes, but I also want to talk about Conquistador Cielo's win for another reason as well. I'll let you start.
Thanks, Brian. Conquistador Cielo, for me, that was the first Belmont Stakes that I actually went to and saw live. And Conquistador Cielo, it was really, really a sloppy track. What is interesting that I think Brian was referring to is that, trained by Woody Stevens, Conquistador Cielo, I don't know if I should say prepped for the race, but that was in the days when the Met Mile was run on Memorial Day weekend, had set the track record in the Met Mile. And Woody Stevens said, hey, my horse is good right now. 5 days later, Brian, 5 days later, brings him back in the Belmont Stakes. And it was historic also because it was the first of the remarkable 5 Belmont Stake winning streak in a row for Woody Stevens.
Yeah, we'll never see anything like this again. 5 straight Belmont Stakes wins. Now, Woody Stevens was a good trainer for a long time before this run, but he was a trainer who was not afraid to race his horses. Conquistador Cielo had a monster allowance win at a mile at Belmont Park less than 2 weeks before that Met Mile win. The Met Mile win was fantastic, where he beat older horses on that Monday before the Belmont Superfast. He won by 7 lengths in that race. And then he comes to the Belmont. Can he do it again? 5 days later, stretching from a mile. He had never been longer than a mile. Now he's going to run a mile and a half. Perhaps the slop helped the cause, but his 14-length win over horses like Linkage and Gata del Sol and a Lomas Ruler. It was just an awesome performance. This was also in the heyday of Mr. Prospector as a sire, and Conquistador Cielo was a special horse who had a special month at Belmont Park, capped off by this amazing run in the 1982 Belmont Stakes. Let's fast forward 4 years later, Matt, because one of my favorites, I'll never forget being in the stands, and I don't know how long they were chanting Woody, 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 but I'll never forget that, being in the stands to see Danzig Connection, a horse who I had seen at the Meadowlands the fall before beat a really talented 2-year-old in a minor stakes named Stormcat. Danzig Connection had some talent, but he was never kind of a superstar, maybe like Conquistador Cielo. But Woody had him ready for a 1.5 mile sloppy track. He had something left for the stretch one when all those ralliers, Personal Flag and Ferdinand and John's Treasure, wanted to rally by him. Danzig Connection had a lot left. And Matt, this was number 5.
Yeah, number 5 in a row for Woody Stephens. Just absolutely remarkable. And as you mentioned, beat a really nice field.
Yeah, that was another good field. And the 3 in between, I guess, would be Caveat and Swale and Creme Fraiche. So Danzig Connection joined Conquistador Cielo, the first and the last on the list. 5 straight Belmont wins for the great Woody Stephens. Matt, I think that's just about it. Oh, we have one more. We talked about Woody Stephens. Let's talk about somebody else. You wanted to mention this race. 1993, Colonial Affair was a nice horse. I love this breeding. He was a son of Pleasant Colony, who was a son of His Majesty. His broodmare was Nijinsky. And Colonial Affair was kind of getting better in the spring of his 3-year-old year, but certainly not a highly respected stakes horse yet in the 1993 Belmont Stakes.
Yeah, and it was a full field that day at Belmont Park, a field that included the great Sea Hero who would go on to win the Travers later in the year. But Colonial Affair was certainly noteworthy because Julie Krone, who had become quite a sensation in her career at that point, based again, doing most of her winning at Monmouth Park during the summers. So certainly was a jockey that, Brian, you and I got to see in person many times at Monmouth Park. Rode Colonial Affair to become the first woman to ever win Belmont Stakes, to ever win a Triple Crown race.
Yeah, Matt, and I'm gonna go back to Coastal, because I said Coastal was not a one-hit wonder, was not a horse who we should be surprised won the Belmont. It happened against Spectacular Bid, but when we talk about Julie Krone, this is no surprise. I'm surprised that she didn't win more Triple Crown races. That's how good in her heyday Julie Krone was. No offense to Rosie Napravnik, who was a great jockey recently, but Julie Krone was the best female rider certainly that I've ever seen, because at her best, she was simply one of the very best jockeys in the country. We saw it in this Belmont Stakes where Colonial Affair was 13-1. I was more of a fan of Kissing Chris, who was a little bit too far back, but Julie Krone had Colonial Affair in the right spot in the middle of the pack, made the move on the turn, got to the lead, and he had a lot of horse left under Julie Krone to win that Belmont over a rallying Kissing Chris. Julie Krone was the first Belmont Stakes winner, female to do it, first to win the Triple Crown. No one's done it since. Julie Krone should be remembered for all of her achievements, and one of the biggest was Colonial Affair in the 1993 Belmont Stakes. Matt, wow. We left off a lot of good Belmonts in the last 15 years, but these are 13 good ones that had special meaning to each of us. Folks, I hope you enjoyed our rundown of the best of the Belmont Stakes. Let me get a parting shot from you, my friend.
Yeah, Brian, and we could have put in so many other horses, but we tried to pick out Triple Crown winners and Triple Crown losses and historic situations like Woody Stephens and Julie Krone. And but yeah, folks, if you had other favorites that you would have included on the list, sure, go ahead and put it in the comments. We'd love to hear from you on it. And as always, I want to thank our producer, Tony Bada Bing, for putting together the show. We'll be back in the next couple weeks for our Belmont Stakes preparation shows.
Yeah, folks, and I hope you enjoyed this show. I know it's not handicapping the races. Like I said, it's a slow weekend. this week. Matt and I, like Matt said, we will be back with a ton on the Belmont Stakes and other races like the Met Mile coming up in just over 2 weeks. But this was fun for us to put together. I hope you enjoy a little bit of the history of the Belmont Stakes. If you haven't yet subscribed to our YouTube channel here at Horse Racing Nation, please do so now. It really helps us out. Turn on those notifications. We really appreciate you watching. We also appreciate Derby Wars, the best contest site out there. They're our sponsor. Folks, we'll be back next week. Belmont Stakes coverage. Don't miss it. We'll see you then right here on HorseCenter.